Thank you for joining us today for Ethnic Studies Week at ASU 2018. I'm Dr. Ursula Orr, Lincoln Professor of Ethics at the School of Social Transformation. And I, along with my awesome colleague, Dr. Rudy Guevara. Rudy, would you mind just standing up so we can see you really quickly? Thanks, Rudy. Rudy and I, we share the pleasure of serving as co-chairs of ASU's Ethnic Studies Working Group. Ethnic Studies Week at ASU was started by ASU Ethnic Studies Working Group, which was founded in 2010 by Wending Chain, who's currently an Associate Professor of American Studies at Scripps College, and a group of interdisciplinary scholars, many of whom coming from the School of Social Transformation, as well as the English Department, Sociology, and other fields as well, but primarily in SST, coming together in order to promote the values of ethnic studies, namely how ethnic studies helps people to recognize and respect the different experiences of diverse communities while finding ways to work together to achieve social justice. Through our signature ASU Ethnic Studies Week programming, as well as our community collaborations, ASU Ethnic Studies Working Group continues to hold and make space for such possibilities to be realized, and the work goes on. This year's theme is reproductive justice, which is a timely conversation given ongoing forced family separation and the detention of immigrant children, Brett Kavanaugh's Supreme Court appointment. It hurts to say that out loud, actually. And the future of women's reproductive rights. Today's Pizza Time Roundtable discussion seeks to define reproductive justice in the context of immigration, the history of sterilization, and young people's rights to contraception. Today's panelists include Zeenat Hasan, co-founder of Arizona Chapter of National Asian Pacific American Women's Forum, Zeenat. Dr. Myla Vincenti, apologize, people. This is what happens when you don't eat. So I just want to say the hypoglycemic aspect of my being is starting to really start to break down. So I'm starting to stutter. I'm starting to slur my words. I apologize, but that's just me being transparent, okay? I'm just going to be really transparent. Any of my students who are currently in the room knows this happens at certain times of the day. So just heads up, apologies. Sorry, Myla, Associate Professor of American Indian Studies, and Dr. Jenny Bryant, Baird Honors College Faculty Fellow. Our panel of community leaders and scholars will offer their insight and expertise on the intersection of public health and the social cultural environment, reproductive choices and ethnic health, gender, sexuality, and federal Indian policy, bioethics, policy and law, and rethinking what health means to marginalized communities. Each panelist will take about 10 to 12 minutes to introduce themselves, the work that they do, how they came to the work that they currently do, and how their scholarship and activism and advocacy intersects with the larger issue on reproductive justice. Again, thank you to our panelists. Anybody's game.
Oh, I can go. I'll get this over with. Before my blood sugar level goes down, and I start smelling the pizza. Anyway, that's going to be showing up.
You know, we'll all get up and eat this.
Yeah, that's right. No, it's been a while since I've come back to this topic. It was my master's thesis, actually, and it's been a while since I've come back to it. Every now and then it pops up. I end up on Native America Calling, talking about sterilization or something, and I got asked to be on this panel, and then I'm also going to present at the International Conference on Genocide and in a couple weeks on sterilization, so it's funny that it's coming back up. So it's been a while, and I'm going to try and go by my notes because we won't go, so I won't go crazy. And because there's a lot. When I started looking at it, and I thought, oh my God, there's a lot. The other thing I also want to say is I want to also acknowledge that we're on indigenous lands, that we're on O'odham Peepash lands, and I want to acknowledge those peoples. So in 1976, there began some investigations, the General Accounting Office investigations, and that it was spurred on by Dr. Connie Pinkerton and Dr. Connie Pinkerton Urey, who's a doctor, who was a doctor, Choctaw and Cherokee, and also talking to Senator Aberesk, because I started hearing stories about women being sterilized, Native women being sterilized, and so What happened in 1976 is that they brought in, and they did a General Accounting Office investigation on the Indian Health Service, and at that point it was under the Health, Education and Welfare. It's now Public Health Service, Indian Health Service, Department of Health and Human Services. And so what they did, and they looked at between 1973 and 1976, and what they found was 3,406 women had been sterilized. And in looking at that and doing the investigation, what they did is they looked at the policy, the procedures, the guidelines. They only looked at the guidelines. They didn't interview anybody. They didn't interview staff. They didn't interview the women. So the women's voices were silenced in that. So what they did find in that, they didn't find what they called sterilization abuse. What they found was uninformed consent. And there's some, we can go into that, but we're not because I'm trying to stick to my tongue. But what they did, they looked at 4 of 12 service areas. They looked at Aberdeen, South Dakota, Albuquerque, New Mexico, Oklahoma City, Oklahoma, Phoenix, Arizona. And what they found was that there was 4 weaknesses in the guidelines, 4 areas of weakness, and and when I say them, that means that they found issues in it, and it's so you can see that there's potential or that it did happen under this. So the first weakness they found was that there was sterilization of persons under 21 years of age. So when they were looking at this, and so you know that there was young women sterilized under 21 years of age. 2, it was a lack of widespread physician understanding of the regulations. So what they're saying is that the physicians didn't understand, and they were looking at some of the paperwork that they had sent out. They said, this is what you're not supposed to do, and yet it was still done. 3rd is inadequately documenting what Indian subjects were told before signing consent forms. And this is important because there's on the forms they're supposed to say you don't have to be sterilized. If you don't want this procedure, you do not have to have it. And that was not on any of the forms. It was not recorded if it had been told, if the women had been told. So there's an area of coercion that isn't being documented, that isn't being checked. And also a lack of definitive requirements for informed consent when sterilizations are performed by contract doctors at contract facilities. At IHS, if IHS hospitals cannot do certain procedures, they contract out to different hospitals. They weren't paying attention to what was happening in those hospitals and these women. So these are these 4 sort of weaknesses that they found in this General Accounting Office report. And so one of the issues about this is it's not under this involuntary sterilization. So they say. But when they didn't talk to any of the women, had they talked to the women, there are plenty of stories that talk about issues of coercion, that they had to sign forms, or they were told that they were going to be sterilized while they were in labor. Their husbands at that time, your husband could sign the consent form. So there's stories of where the husbands were coerced into or told that they needed the women needed these procedures, and so there's and even stories of a woman had a hysterectomy, and she had known, and this is what sort of started it. She had known about kidney transplant. She wanted to know if she could get a womb transplant because earlier she had been sterilized, and so that started some of the questions. So in looking at this, it places the blame more on the forms and the women, and it doesn't look at it institutionally. Doesn't look at the systemic issues of this. and so they're only looking at the IHS, they're only looking at that. But if you pull that, they broaden that lens out, you pull that lens out and start looking at it more in terms of through various frameworks, then you start to see a longer history of attacks on American Indian women and children. If you look at it through colonialism and settler colonialism, you see this attempt to make Indians disappear. Through genocide, actual genocide, besides, and if, I'm not even going to go into this, because if you look at the UN genocide, this fits under what is a genocide? What is genocide? Cultural genocide, looking at it through assimilation, loss of culture, loss of language. Our children are our future, so this is our this is passing on the culture. Also, you see it through loss of lands. You hear a silencing of voices, our history, and you see it if you look through colonization, settler colonialism. You also look at the policies of boarding schools taking children away from the families. My grandfather was taken into a boarding school at age 4, and looking at relocation. And activism really brought out to light a lot of these policies. If you look at it through reproductive justice, it brings together colonial and colonization and white supremacy. It gets us to look at it in under these the state, and it also gets us to look at it as the right to reproduce, the right to not reproduce, and also the right to parent, and the right in a safe and healthy environment. And that piece becomes really important also for this, because at the same time, in 1978, 2 years after this GAO report, Senator Abereshk was also pushed through what is the Indian Child Welfare Act, because so many children were taken out of Indian homes, placed into foster homes, and then adopted out to non-Indian families. So when you look at it in this context, you start bringing out the parenting issue too. And when we're looking at that, it becomes really, it brings it right literally to the present also. Because actually of this month, because in October 4th, a federal U.S. District Court Judge, Reed O'Connor, struck down ICWA, Indian Child Welfare Act, saying that it had preferential treatment in adoption proceedings. So what we see is that bringing it, we can talk about it through sterilization and reproductive justice, but it brings it all the way into that. I'll say, I'll stop here, but I'll say, ICWA has been really important because one of my cousins passed away, and so did the mother, and their little boy was starting to get sent into the foster care system, and ICWA, through ICWA, the tribe has custody of him, and he's going now to his paternal grandmother. And if it wasn't for that, he would have been sent out. And so when I look at it, this is very, and when I look at this, my thesis was called Lost Generation, but it was also in my generation. And we're looking at that generation, but there's stories way before that from the 1920s of sterilization of Native women being taken place. So that 3,406 is just a drop. So I just wanted to stop. So I'll end there.
Okay. Okay, so I'm Jenny Bryan. I work at the Barrett Honors College. My training is in bioethics and science and technology studies. My work sits at the intersection of ethics, science, business, and politics. And so I started researching assisted reproductive technologies, thinking about the ways in which we were paying exorbitant amounts of money to create children through different means. And I started looking at this after I had an experience of being an egg donor in college. So our research topics often find us, or we find them. But so I was thinking about how and when and why do we make families, and how are particular technologies deployed to promote or inhibit such efforts, and then also thinking about what policy efforts or lack of policy efforts in the case of assisted reproductive technologies aid what kinds of reproductive projects for what bodies. And then, so along the lines of technology, in 2012, the US started, a couple states started implementing these Medicaid policies to promote the use of long-acting reversible contraceptives in Medicaid women immediately postpartum. So South Carolina was the first, and since then, and there was kind of a slow trickle, and then in the last year those have doubled. So we now have 41 states plus the District of Columbia have laws on the book that allow hospitals to be reimbursed for the insertion of long-acting reversible contraceptives. If we just look at the state of Georgia, so their justification was, so they had this stat that said in 2010, 60%, I don't know how they got these numbers, so we can talk about numbers later, but in 2010, 60% of pregnancies in Georgia were unplanned, and that cost the state $918 million. So they justified this policy using a cost-saving logic, right? So that was all throughout their promotional materials. We're going to save so much money if we get women on Medicaid onto birth control and onto a long-acting form of birth control that is free of human user error. Nowhere in these policies did they say anything about what the women themselves wanted or were looking for in terms of their family planning or their reproductive needs. In Georgia, so in all of these policies, they talk about cost, what type of device they'll reimburse, and the time of insertion. So most policies don't say anything about the time of insertion. But Georgia does. Georgia says that the hospitals will only be reimbursed if the IUD is inserted within 10 minutes of delivering the placenta. So that's an interesting and shocking number, right? And so if we look at the scientific data about when can we safely insert these devices into bodies, we have we have really bad data is really the takeaway there. But some data that says that the safest time is 4 weeks later. There is a tiny amount of data that says within 10 to 15 minutes is actually pretty safe, and anything in between is not safe. So the policies that specify no time at all actually might be some of the most dangerous because they leave it up to, so Myla referenced physician understanding. There is no special training for doctors on how to do this. And so we leave it up to physicians to interpret and understand incomplete data. And so, we have, so these policies have proliferated across the US, and they're quite interesting in and of themselves. We can ask a lot of questions about them. One of the things that's heartbreaking about them is that none of them mention what happens when the women want the devices removed. And if we remember, in the late 90s in Washington, D.C., women who were recipients of welfare were mandated to have Norplant, the subcutaneous implants, inserted, and there were lots of problems. Most of them had them removed within a couple months because they had such severe side effects. But the policy there paid for the insertion and did not pay for the removal. So the women had to pay often $250 to have the device removed. So we have these new Medicaid policies that again don't say anything about what happens when these women want the device removed, and that to me signals a pretty big opportunity for reproductive oppression, right? make a particular technology available for your cost-saving logic, that doesn't say anything about their particular empowerment, it's dangerous. And what we notice is, I don't know, has anyone noticed any ads for IUDs or implants as they scroll through? So some of you are not. So the people that we see in the ads, right, they're fun-loving, they're like planful, agentic, I'm free-loving and I can plan my future and I don't want to have a baby now so I can do this. So the people to whom LARC is advertised are not the same group of people to whom these policy and programmatic interventions target. So we see this disparity, right? So LARC promotion discourse is different across the country, right? So we have advertisements that target one group, and then we have policies and programs that target a different kind of group, one that tends to be low income, racial minority, and that's problematic. So LARC proponents argue that it's a magic bullet solution, right? It's been described as a hassle-free contraceptive, free of human user error. The former president of Planned Parenthood has promoted LARC and said, it's no form of birth control could be cheaper, and once it's in a woman, once we get the damn thing in the woman, they can't change their mind, right? So what I care about is the ways in which we talk about LARC, the ways in which we're talking about it as empowering, but for the state policies, they are not at all. They don't actually care about what the Medicaid women want, and so the technology, which has been described as magical or neutral or inherently oppressive, is an interesting technology to think about reproductive justice and where we see the state exerting efforts to control particular bodies and what that might mean. It's just fairly recently we've noticed that LARC promotion efforts have moved into prisons. I don't know if anyone remembers, but last year a Tennessee judge was offering a 30-day reduction in sentences for prisoners who chose long-acting birth control. So this was vasectomy for men and Nexplanon implants for women. And what we might notice there is, again, we're choosing a device that denies agency to the woman. I'm not that kind of doctor, but I'm really not recommending that anyone self-removes their IUD, but you could. You could do it. But with the Norplant, you need a doctor to remove the implant. So that judge was quickly barred from stopping that program. But at least 100 prisoners took that judge up on his offer. We have, and then again in Tennessee, we have the Tennessee State Department is promoting a program to encourage the use of LARC. And the way that they talk about it is that it will be the end to the opioid crisis. So we're trying to think about how, so the state shows these videos to women in prison that says, look at what happens when, that are all about neonatal abstinence syndrome. So what happens to babies who are born addicted to drugs? And so if you get birth control, your baby won't suffer like these babies. So there's a video from the Children's Hospital. There's a video of a woman who's had 3 children born drug addicted. And I think they said 3,500 women have been through the program. We're trying to use a FERPA to get more information about this program. 3,500 women have gone through the program, and 700 have chosen birth control. And then in the academic world of bioethics and public health, you have a lot of papers recently that talk about how we can and should go into prisons to promote this kind of birth control because it's empowering. But the couple studies that ask the women in prisons what they want they say, well, we worry because we don't have access to good health care. We do want to have children. And so there's different messaging. And so I guess what I'll end with is saying, the technology it's not that we want to say that the technology is bad. We recognize that it is absolutely, when I say we, I'm working with colleagues at the University of Tennessee and the University of South Carolina. We're doing things like looking up policies and holding focus groups with different kinds of people to ask them how they feel about life with a lark. And so I guess what I want to end by saying is what we're seeing is a contrasting messaging from different groups, state agencies, or pharmaceutical companies, where we see a contrast between the messages and the lived experiences of living with these technologies. So on the one side, we see nearly universal praise, whether it's an empowerment rhetoric, which is a sad irony when we think about reproductive justice advocacy and how it started. And then the enthusiasm for LARC is not always reflected in the conversations that we're having with young women. So anyway, we found it a really fascinating technology to explore the concept of reproductive justice and how narratives move and are trafficked, and the work that they do in different spaces. It's just a little bit about our
So, hi everybody, my name is Zeenat Hasan. I'm a activist in the community. I'm a co-founder of the local chapter of the National Asian Pacific American Women's Forum, the Arizona chapter, which started around 2011 after the passage of the what we call the Prenda law in Arizona, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. I'm also on the board of Sonoran Prevention Works, which is a harm reduction organization for people who use drugs. And I don't really come to this work through the scholarship. When I was doing scholarship, it was really more about ethics and how ethics are encoded in human rights, especially like international human rights and the covenants that many countries are party to. Rights of the migrant, rights of refugees, women, children. As an activist, I'm really more drawn to the personal, sort of what compels us to migrate, what restricts us, what facilitates that type of movement. And in that context, what happens to our reproductive life as we're migrating, as we're making decisions to migrate, as our families are being disrupted. What happens to our sexuality, what happens to our bodily autonomy, what happens to our right to parent our children in a safe and healthy environment. And then what do we do as activists to ensure that those rights are respected, protected, and fulfilled? So, in that sense, I suppose justice for me is it's an exercise. Why do we need reproductive justice if there weren't any reproductive oppression? That's about as academic as I get, I think. But I think three things that I really kind of want to put out there for conversation is the decisions that people make as migrants. I'm a zero-generation immigrant, which just means I immigrated here myself. I came here as a child, not with my parents. Lived undocumented for many years, myself and my family. Lived in a multi-generational household. And I think my father only got his citizenship very recently. Went through kind of all of the struggles that undocumented immigrant families do. My parents were divorced so that we could stay in the country. Just all the family dynamics that went along with that, I was witness to. And it would be very sort of tidy to say that journey kind of brought me into the work, but it really didn't. It really didn't. It's kind of interesting that the work that I do now somehow reveals my history to me. It wasn't a very neat trajectory. I really didn't think a lot about my existence and then what was I going to do with that experience. It's really only been revealed to me now, and it continues to be revealed to me. But one thing I was very, very in tune to, even as a child, was this precarious and high-risk environment that immigrants are constantly in, whether it's during a migration journey, whether it's for a few hours, whether it's for days, weeks, months, a lifetime, or generations. I mean, this high-risk environment can happen, like for my family, it was over 3 generations of migrating. The decisions that we make in that kind of environment, the decision to, like my parents did, send me to the United States without them, not having any sense of what that destination looked like or what it would be like for me. But what made them, I've not had this conversation with my parents, it's a difficult one to have, but what made them make those types of decisions for themselves and for me? The risk of sexual assault, the very proximate risk of sexual assault and violence that migrants face on a journey or just in any circumstance where they're in a high-risk situation and vulnerable. So just kind of the precariousness of migration and being an immigrant, being an undocumented immigrant, those things are very present in my mind. Something that's happened in my lifetime is this heightened criminalization and increasing policing of people who look like me. Essentially, since 9/11 is kind of when I became most conscious of this type of policing of Muslim communities, of immigrant communities. And with heightened criminalization and heightened policing, people in our community are ended up incarcerated and also deported. And that disruption of the family, that is the basic tool of oppression, is disrupt the family structure, which is exactly what's happened in immigrant communities like mine. Reproductive life doesn't stop when we're incarcerated, it doesn't stop when we're deported. And, the impact on deportation, not just on the deportee, but you talk to the families, you talk to those that are left behind, and talk about the impact and what that does to the family. It's just another part of deportation. And I think that the third thing that I just kind of want to highlight is just the exploitation of women and women of color when we pass laws like PRENDA. So PRENDA is the Prenatal Non-Discrimination Act. In Arizona, when they first passed it, it was called the Susan B. Anthony and the Frederick Douglass Prenatal Non-Discrimination Act. It has nothing to do with Susan B. Anthony or Frederick Douglass.
I want to know what they're signifying on.
Huh?
I said I want to know what they're signifying on with using those 2 names specifically for the campaign and for the audience that they're trying to address.
Right. Because it was this law that basically was trying to protect fetuses. Passed in Arizona in 2011, from whom? Right. So the billboards that you started to see in 21 other states, I believe, I think it's 21, have passed a PRENDA type of law. You started to see billboards in the South. The most dangerous place for a Latino baby is in the mother's womb. That Black women are committing genocide in their communities. That Asian women are bringing these dangerous practices from Asian countries and aborting female fetuses at this rate that we have to stop them. We have to stop them from doing these terrible things. And that was the basis of PRENDA. And so in this kind of heightened police state and this sort of heightened criminalization, that's sort of an easy narrative to sell, is that, we need to, weirdly, it's weird how this works to me, but you can sell that narrative that we have to protect children and babies and fetuses from women of color, from immigrants, because they are the most dangerous, and not just immigrants, Black women. The law in Arizona specifically was a race selection, sex selection ban, said that Black women are having too many abortions, that Asian women are aborting too many female fetuses, and that, basically the likes of Trent Franks, white men have to save them. White men around the country have to save babies from their own mothers. Those to me are the most disturbing things, but the law is still on the books in Arizona, and what our chapter is working to do is to repeal PRENDA here, to keep it from coming to our federal National Congress. It did come up in National Congress when Trent Franks was still a representative, and I'm so glad that he's not any longer. His time was up, actually. he was one of those victims of the Me Too movement. And so he's no longer in the National Congress. Yeah, time's up, Trent Franks. But he did introduce this in the National Congress. They stripped away the race selection part of it, but kept the sex-selective abortion part of the ban. Again, based on the premise that Asian women cannot be trusted to make decisions about their own reproductive health. So, I think just really those three things, kind of the precariousness of being an immigrant, migrating, just living as an immigrant, and the heightened criminalization of policing of our communities, and then finally just the exploitation of women of color as tools to restrict access for all women. And again, it's odd how that works. Is that those Prenda laws, they're not about discrimination, but they work in that space. Somehow they work in that space when kind of the consciousness of the country is told to be suspicious of immigrants, be suspicious of people of color. Somehow that narrative works. You can use people as tools to then restrict rights for everybody, for women and especially. So I'll stop there and kind of.
So thank you. I have tons of questions and thoughts and comments that I would like to make. But first, I'd like to hear from the audience, questions, points of connection that you might have heard from each of the presentations. I'm really interested in discussing maybe a little bit more about the discriminatory nature of these policies, how these policies might be written under the guise of benefiting the innocent or the voiceless at the cost and consequence of demonizing specifically Black and women of color and Indigenous women. Those are just some thoughts that I currently have, but I would like to hear from the audience questions, points of connection, points of confusion. Does anybody know what LARC is? It's no. Some do, some may not,
Sorry, it's an acronym that stands for long-acting reversible contraceptives. So within that's the IUD and the subcutaneous implant. So the IUD is, the brand names are Mirena, Skyla,
Meridian is another one.
Meridian.
I just get the advertisement, so that's all I'm saying.
Yeah, and then the implant is Nexplanon.
Yes.
So the implant is a little bar.
Which used to be Norplant. And
Which used to be Norplant.
there's also a correlation between, has anybody seen, anyone seen advertisements via maybe Netflix or not Netflix, but Hulu specifically, for contraceptives or for IUD specifically? Because there's a correlation between how the media follows and targets its audience with regard to reproductive tools and technologies. So if you happen to be a woman between a certain age group, or maybe you looked at a particular site, you might find yourself being stopped by Facebook to check out certain kind of reproductive options that will make your life freer. I also encourage you guys to look at the individuals who are on these commercials. That's also very telling about this notion about who is targeted compared to who is encouraged. And also the discourse that's used to legitimate this choice compared to another conversation or another discourse of, be fruitful and multiply. Who is encouraged to multiply? Who is encouraged to have fun? And here I'm sitting here thinking about the construction of womanhood and what a good, real civic woman looks like, what she might be encouraged to do, how she might be encouraged to perform, what she might look like, what kind of body, right? I'm running my mouth. Again, questions, thoughts, points of confusion. Yes, Imani.
I just wanted to point out, I noticed when I watch certain TV channels, because you mentioned how the media kind of target different audience. I noticed if I watch quote unquote Black channels like BET or TV One or younger generations like MTV or whatever, they have a lot of commercials about contraception. They're like, take this birth control, and then I turn it on the
Lifetime
Network or Lifetime or Food Channel, and it's nothing.
No commercials at all on Food Channel about reproduction.
About having families, but the other one about make sure you take birth control. And I'm like,
about controlling family, not having family. Any thoughts about my panelists in it? Or Jenny or Myla?
Well, so the advertisements that we see are quite like the New York Public Health has these funky graphic designs that are like, you spent the night in Brooklyn, but you left your birth control in Manhattan. Maybe the IUD is right for you, right? So you're like fun and forgetful, but we'll forgive you because you're planning for your future. Or you're the right kind of audience. But then one of the things that we notice is at the state and local level, we have these organizations. So one is called A Step Ahead Foundation in Tennessee that offers $50 Walmart gift cards to teens to come in and learn about IUDs, right? So that's a different kind of imagination of who's the teen who's going to be seduced by a $50 Walmart gift card. A Step Ahead Foundation also has as its mission, we want to provide access to birth control to all women, but if you go further into their messaging, they only provide IUDs or implants. So all birth control for them is just the kind that you can't mess up, right? And so we see that kind of rhetoric and messaging over and over again.
Well, with Native people, especially early on with Norplant, what's interesting is to look at who the populations were that tested these drugs before they even went on the market. And there's some of that has been with indigenous women, had been tested, especially North Dakota. You see North and South Dakota, that some of the Native women were test subjects. The other side of this GAO report, which also goes, the other side of the first part of this GAO report was an investigation on children in boarding schools, and that they were being tested for trachoma, for your eyes. They were being tested for certain, being able to use a certain treatment. And the parents and the children never consented, and it was brought up. It was because they said the school and the school officials were the guardians, and so that they could actually have the authority to consent to the using certain treatments or testing certain treatments. So you see, so part of it is when you're looking at where did these drugs come from? Who were the populations that it was tested on? And Norplant was pushed. Norplant had a certain weight limit when it first came out. It had a certain weight limit until it hit Indian population. Not to say that we're all a little heavy, but as soon as it hit Indian population, IHS, that weight limit got taken off of the drug didn't get changed, but the weight limit they said go ahead, put it into IHS.
Which is problematic too, because that affects the efficacy.
Mm-hmm. And IHS also wouldn't pay to take it out. They'll put it in, but they won't take it out.
Mm-hmm. There's also no instructions about how to take out or remove these implants. So many women had tons of complications. Some of these, in addition to the scarring, multiple episodes or appointments for extraction. Some of these items actually bursted into people's bloodstreams, it's really problematic. Professor Ross.
I'd like either of the panelists to speak about the upstream motivation, because obviously it's not about protecting the health of vulnerable people, but it has political consequences for the demographic changes anticipated in the country. I'm convinced voting rights and other things are implicated in manipulating these populations. So could the panelists speak to that?
It's about, like I mentioned earlier, it's about cultural and political genocide for us, for Native people. But it was also during the time when I was looking at this and looking at across ethnic groups, you especially in the 70s, you especially saw it with, and I'm waiting for it to come back out now, for immigrant women, Mexican immigrant women, because what they were trying to do was, and it's all the paperwork, it's in the paperwork, trying to deter anchor babies. And so what they were doing was that if you were going to have come over the border and have your child, this is probably the last child you're going to ever have. So in a lot of the hospitals, and there was a lawsuit in a Los Angeles medical hospital that the women sued that they were being involuntarily sterilized to stop immigration. And I'm waiting for it to come back out, because especially with the rhetoric right now, I keep watching, because
When was the first issue?
This was in 1970s, and that lawsuit was in 1973, I think. The immigration issue was heavy then. It's come back, so I'm waiting for that to become more, for it to come out much more. But that's just in response to some of that.
And I think for Asian American communities, for me, I do bring it back to the disruption of family and what that does to our sense of civic responsibility and civic engagement. Some of organizations like NAPA, what we are trying to do is to elevate people to be involved civically and to be involved politically, because there are these terrible things happening in our community. When the default really is, gosh, there are these terrible things happening in our community, in our family, generally we're not thinking about voting, we're not really thinking about our civic life, we're thinking about how do we keep this family together, and that's it, and it becomes a scramble. And so every time a person is deported, you see kind of who's left. All the burden of raising the children shifts to one person or a couple of people. You take a parent out of the family unit, and it throws the family into chaos. And so I do think that is a tool to keep people from being civically engaged. It's just disrupting the entire family structure and any hope of stability.
Yeah, our argument is that LARC promotion right now in the U.S. is functioning as a kind of neoliberal form of population control, where the state is acting as a market-creating agent that frames LARC in terms of empowerment and choice, but that kind of motivation is systematically erased in terms of other outcomes, which are cost saving in the form of state expenditures on state and social health services. And so we see that science and technology is being deployed to upwardly redistribute life chances and to limit the agency and autonomy along the axis of race, gender, religion, and nation, among other dimensions. And so, yeah, it's not to say that LARC is not, LARC is a tool for reproductive justice. It can be deeply empowering, and yet the ways in which it is promoted currently, right now, feels dangerous.
I would just also add, like the Prenda laws, when we're in an environment that promotes this narrative that immigrants are people, that are suspicious. You have to be suspicious of immigrants and their motives and why they're here and why they have children and that sort of thing. It just makes it easier to pass laws that restrict civic engagement in communities of color. It just does. It's just really strange to me again why that works, but it does.
In the beginning, we spoke quickly about you mentioned Kavanaugh, and we're talking about political climate right now, and I wanted to know if there's November 6th, there's a lengthy ballot that we all are probably
If we haven't already gotten it,
we're probably just sitting on it and we're uninformed and we get a lot of advertisements along with reproductive justice
and misinformed.
ones about like the scandals and stuff, and I want to know if there's anything that you all could share about what we should look out for and who we should look out for, like who's a stakeholder in reproductive justice that's on our ballot.
That's a great question. Thank you so much.
I think that one part has pretty clearly stated that they're looking to erase a lot of social health services.
This is slightly tricky, I understand. I just want to say I appreciate this moment right now. I really do, Jenny. I appreciate it, and I'm with you.
Okay, so it's.
Can I say one thing real quickly?
Go for it.
Sweetheart, what's your name? Christina. First, again, that was a really great question, and just to provide a little caveat of some sorts. It's a great question, but it's a complex and complicated question. And in some ways, it might be, depending upon how any one of the panelists might answer, it might seem as though we are advocating that individuals go out and vote for a particular individual. And that's not the question that you asked at all. You just asked to be informed. What are some of the candidates talking about? What are some things we should look out for? But again, in answering the question, it's a little tricky. So I just want to say that, and this is for everyone in the room, is that an effort to avoid the question. It is, there's a landmine, a couple of landmines, and how do I work these landmines out? Is that remotely helpful? Dr. Ross?
I did.
Dr. Ross, our keynote speaker for later on this
I
evening.
just heard the phrase Kavanaugh, so I'm not sure if I caught the gist of it, but one of the things that I'll probably be talking about later on is the importance of Kavanaugh's selection to the Supreme Court is framed as an attack on abortion rights, but it's actually protection for criminal prosecution for any elected official who might have committed crimes.
Mm-hmm.
And so it really behooves us to pull the lens back and see the larger picture of who may need to be protected with that particular vote on the Supreme Court. And I think that's a way to answer the question without advocating for any particular candidate or indicting any unindicted co-conspirators.
Thank you, Dr. Ross.
I would also just, talk to the people that are running for office, talk to their campaign staff, ask them what their views are on comprehensive sex education, ask them what their views on prenatal laws are, ask them what their views are on universal health care, ask them what their views are on the Hyde Amendment. Just ask them what their view, if reproductive justice is important to you, ask them what their views are. And if they know, they know, and if they don't know, it's probably, it could be an opportunity for you to let them know that you know, and that these are the things that you're concerned about.
Both educate and advocate.
Yeah, both educate and advocate, that's right.
There was Kyra?
I'm interested in what reproductive justice might look like for queer or trans bodies. I don't know what research has been done in that area, if any, but I do know that when we're talking about ads on Hulu, Facebook, all of these people are straight, and almost all of the time I think they're white. I have yet to see a person of color in that space. But we talked a little bit about what it means for, and I think one of you touched on sexuality, and I just, where does it fit in, and how does it impact queer and trans bodies, and how might it impact now that we know what the president just said yesterday about rolling back gender classification for trans bodies and being able to identify in the binary as male and female? What does it look like? And that's a large question.
No, that's an excellent question. So IUDs are useful to are sought after by anyone who is seeking to make their uterus temporarily hospitable, right? And we know that's not just cis women. And so I think that there are lots of so first of all, there was a really beautiful set of articles in the Boston Review recently. The issue was called Once and Future Feminist, that was thinking about what would change if we thought of all reproduction as assisted, right? So not just assisted reproductive technologies, but how do we take for granted the ways in which the ways that we all need help with reproduction, right? Reproduction is never just a thing that happens, right? And so what would we do if we got rid of the natural versus assisted binary? And so the main author's proposal was, how would we advance LGBTQ rights and reproductive rights if we asserted a positive right to reproduce? So thinking about what can we do, what can the state do, how can we deploy particular resources, what can we do as communities if we started with an affirmation that everybody has a right to reproduce, right? And so the asserting a positive right to reproduce forces us to acknowledge that some families are at risk of separation, that gestation is hard and risky work, that some people need help getting pregnant, and whatever that looks like, right? And it looks
Maintaining.
and it doesn't always look that different for queer bodies. So I think that the first step is recognizing that there are lots of ways to make families, and models of queer kinship can serve as a beautiful inspiration for the rest of us, and how can we, and in part, actually, I mean, this might be a silver lining of the weirdness of the U.S. assisted reproductive industry, which is a multi-billion-dollar industry, is that it has helped queer families make families. They have helped queer families make their families in ways that make sense to them.
The adoption.
Well, surrogacy, in vitro fertilization, sperm donation, egg donation, right? So we have lots of different ways in which people can make their families. But yeah, if we ever saw a trans man with an idea, that would be a particular moment. But thank you.
I was just going to add, I work in public health, and so much protecting the rights of trans and queer people just has to do with stigma, addressing stigma in our healthcare system. For me, that's just kind of one of those frontline things that we have to do somehow. I don't know how exactly, but I know that stigma within healthcare is a huge problem. But I would say, from the NAPOF perspective, it is very, very important for us to protect trans, queer, gay people from deportation, because that can actually just be a death sentence for many people. That's how kind of it shows up in the work of that.
And I think it's important, when you look at even just the book of, reproductive justice, an introduction. I mean, it's about, looking at it in terms of the right to have a child, right not to have a child, right to parent in a safe environment. It's not saying right for a woman to reproduce, not right for a man to reproduce. It's broadly, and it's broadly spoken, and talking about sexual autonomy and gender freedom. That it's not saying, we got to define it in these terms. Leaving it undefined allows that opening that for queer, transgender, if we want to talk about sexuality studies, that's a point that disrupts so many narratives. Gender can disrupt to a certain point. I mean, especially when we're talking about it in native communities, and gender can do one thing, but sexuality sexuality disrupts so many narratives, and it opens it up, and you can when it disrupts, you can start seeing some of the voices of opposition and support are, and where it's coming from, and so I think in that sense, because it's open, because it's not defining, it's very useful.
So I just have a question of clarification. You mentioned involuntary sterilization to prevent immigration, but you said it don't come back. And so I was just wondering, was this an act of, how do we know to look out for it in the future?
Well, and I think if you learn from history, you can learn how to cover it up. That's the problem. But and I think there's in terms of advocacy of certain, and I think this goes back to voting and stuff. If you're looking at there's services that are that can be masked as this is what we're talking about with the narratives. There are services that are that can be masked as we're being helpful and we're not, and they're not. But I think the other thing is looking for advocacy in the hospitals. I mean, immigrant advocacy, where if women are having to go into the hospital, that there's advocates there for translations. With one of the things that was a huge issue with Native and with immigrant women's language issues, language barriers. That's one of the how it's getting defined. That becomes a huge issue. And there was something else, and I can't remember what I was going to say. And this is where more than anything, women's voices, people's voices are. Them not being silenced is even more important. The stories coming out, because if you look at just the paperwork, there's nothing wrong. There's a few issues, but when you start listening to the stories, when you have focus groups, when you bring those those voices out, they're the ones that are going to tell you, and that's I think, to me, the place where that is going to, where, and if there's any abuse, it's going to be found. It's looking for, because the same with the immigrant families being detained. It could have been held very secret if it wasn't out and wasn't being spoken about in public. If voices are silenced, those things disappear. I've seen it with our histories, and I think that's where it's more important.
Yeah, I used to run a medical interpretation program that trained and deployed medical interpreters. And the things we were hearing just from community, and mainly we were working with refugee communities at the time, people showing up to hospitals, providers, and having procedures done to them that they had no idea what was actually being done to them, because either they didn't have an interpreter at all or they didn't have a trained interpreter. So, we were encountering people that had, informed consent was a joke, right? Because you might have an interpreter and none of the forms are actually translated in any of the languages that people speak. You're lucky if you have a form translated in Spanish, but even that is not that common.
And you're making an assumption that can read.
Yeah, that was the other thing. Many of the refugee communities that we work with were not literate in their own language, much less in English. And so the training of the medical interpreters was super important, but because we came to realize that people were being pulled out of the custodian's office to come and interpret during the medical visit, and it was just kind of egregious things that were happening. And during the Obama administration, the Office of Civil Rights was actually very proactive. You could file a complaint, and they would bring an investigation, and they did that with the St. Joe's Hospital here recently. Our organization filed a complaint on behalf of a woman who didn't speak English, had a procedure that was done to her that she did not consent to, didn't even know what was happening. And they came out and did an investigation. I've not filed a complaint with OCR under this administration, but I don't know how that would go. I really don't know what's happening at OCR right now. But I would just say, those are the struggles of immigrant communities when it comes to our healthcare system. Just not knowing, no consent, no information.
No question.
So the theme of the informedness of consent, or the weaponization of informed consent, has been a through line through all of the presentations. But the framing of Indigenous sterilization as a problem of uninformed consent really struck me as troubling and fascinating. So I was wondering if you could speak a bit more about the logic of that argument. What would bureaucratically approved informed consent actually look like, and what does that leave out, and how does that entice informed consent as a concept?
What they did, their suggestions were that it needed the forms needed to say, if you don't, nothing will happen if you do not go along with this procedure. So they stated
So it's
that
a
the
standard
form,
statement, a boilerplate statement that says X, but it doesn't
Right.
actually.
They did mention interpreters, but we're talking about 500 nations, and we're talking about, if we're going to IHS, that there's a large number of different tribes have different languages. So finding an interpreter for everyone is difficult enough. And then sort of translating some of the stuff into native languages. There was what they also said is that there was the other part of this, there was no, you could sign the paperwork and get the procedure right then. They changed that to signing the paperwork and waiting 30 days. So that was supposed to be helpful, though they were arguing against some of that, because if people were coming in, wanted the procedure, they had to wait 30 days, and if they lived out. So there's those. They put in, it was all procedural, it was all policy within the hospital. It didn't address ideology. It didn't address that white supremacy as a foundational reason for wanting populations to be
Limited.
Yes, and so there, in one way, the informed consent meant that they knew what was going to happen. They had time to change their mind. They knew they weren't going to be coerced. Those kinds of things. That's what but they never addressed. What was never addressed: colonialism, white supremacy, the ideology behind why this was going on, how it was going on.
I think part of the issue has to do with what does consent really mean.
Mm-hmm.
And this is, and these policies, this is another point that I want to highlight that Dr. Carpio was making about the institutional systemic aspects of these practices, right? I don't want to say the same verbatim paperwork that was given to people of the various nations was given to people on the island of Puerto Rico, was given to African American women, is and it continually still being given to people throughout the nation writ large and various other, I want to say, colonies. Because I still very much see them operating under a colonial regime. But this isn't atypical, and this isn't isolated. This is a national, on some levels universal, and strategically organized kind of targeting of of certain groups, of certain cultures, of certain ethnic groups, of certain racial backgrounds for eradication. both for the purposes of gaining access to natural resources, both for the purposes of exploiting the labor. In some cases, some of this labor is reproductive labor, right? Because there's a determination about who can and who should not have children, who can, who should, and who should not have access to birth control, and not just birth control, but just reproductive health care, period. And so these things are all connected. I just want to, I guess, reinforce the fact that this isn't just national, that this is also larger and international.
The other part of this too is if you go in and the doctor says you need this procedure, how many times do you question? How many times? I mean,
or even know have the wherewithal to get a second opinion, or have the ability and the finances, the resources to get a second opinion.
Especially in IHS, you have one doctor that's and I won't even go to some of the sort of stories, but one of the things is you don't what I went through, because I couldn't. It's a silent abuse because you can't tell, and two, you can't get any information unless the women, and that was a whole nother thing, was getting information. But what the information I could get was that sterilization was the primary diagnosis. And that says a whole nother thing beyond it was. So when they were diagnosing something, the diagnosis, the treatment, the primary treatment was sterilization. It was more times than it being tertiary. So if something was happening, and I talked to a woman, and she said she advocated for herself. She says, no, I'm not going to be sterilized. Because she was having hormonal problems, and with the hormonal problems, the doctor said, okay, you need to a hysterectomy.
No, that means
and that was immediate, and that was the immediate. So, but she said, no, I'm not going to do that. She went in and did her own family medical history, and she found out that it was went through her family. There was some hormonal issues, and she ended up on a certain medication. And then she later wrote to me and said, I'm getting married, I'm pregnant, and I'm, all of this stuff. But so there's a part of it that's consent, but there's a part of it you can't deal with the ideology. How do you police the ideology? The what brings this to bear, so.
I was just gonna say, if you're interested in consent, when you talk about internationally what that means, I mean, you just look at how drug companies do clinical trials in other countries, and what does that consent actually mean? And then I'm also reminded of the court proceedings where a 5-year-old was made to sign her name on a form, and a 2-year-old was brought into court to consent to being removed from the country. I mean, what does consent mean in that circumstance?
Yeah, the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists, and then a recent public health paper on the perspectives of sexual and reproductive health have both advocated for advocated for the contraceptive needs of incarcerated women, but specifically around long-acting reversible contraceptives, and they just say that that counseling should be provided non-coercively, but of course don't specify in any way what it means to be non-coercive in a space designed to coerce. And so we have no record, because the policies don't mandate what that consent form looks like when we're providing counseling to Medicaid women who are pregnant, what it would look like for them to choose a birth control, and then to choose it as soon as to make that choice again, as soon as they've pushed a human out. And so,
my question is, what progress has groups such as Planned Parenthood or Indian Health Services made as far as access for reproductive rights, specifically maybe amongst women on welfare or just in general, since I guess the 1970s?
She said
Can we talk to Ross, Professor Ross?
If you don't mind.
Please do.
Yeah, I was gonna say.
Just to reiterate one
She's
more
the one.
time, Professor Loretta Ross will be our keynote speaker later on this afternoon from 4:30 to 5:30. Her talk, can I give the other part of it?
Yeah.
Because I think it's really apropos given the conversation that we're having right now, and also thinking about this larger conversation about the connection between immigration and reproductive justice, but demographically doomed, right? I just want you guys to sit with that. That's the parenthetical for the actual title that's authorized on the flyers. But keep that theme in mind as you listen to her speak later on today. Again, the theme is demographically doomed. And I hope our conversation today provides a little bit of anchoring and context for what you guys will get from Professor Ross later on this evening. Professor Ross?
Just an answer to your question. In the 1960s and the early 1970s, there was a lot of bipartisan support for family planning, but I imagine that the different parties did it for different reasons. But the Republicans who were in support of family planning largely saw it as a way of curbing urban unrest in communities of color, particularly Latina and African American communities. And so it was actually Republican President Nixon who authorized the Office of Economic Opportunity to begin the first Title X funding for Planned Parenthood. And so what that greatly did was increase the amount of clinics and opportunities for low-income women to access well-woman care as well as family planning care. Now, of course, with the election of Ronald Reagan and the organization of the anti-abortion wing of the Republican Party, that's all been reversed. So you have these incessant attacks on Planned Parenthood and public health as a whole and stuff. But there's a long history of how reproductive politics is manipulated for political power, and it shifts over time. I think that those of us who support family planning, particularly back in the 70s, we did it as a form of women's empowerment. Whereas I said Republicans at the time did it because they wanted to curb urban unrest by reducing the populations and stuff like that. So.
And here in Arizona, Goldwater was an advocate. His wife was a real advocate. So he was an advocate for Planned Parenthood.
Exactly.
And the IUD has largely seen a resurgence because of Warren Buffett is one of the leading funders of IUDs and has funded 2 programs, one in Colorado and one in Missouri, that allows women to choose whatever form of birth control they want. The program in Colorado saw a large reduction in teen and unintended pregnancies, but then the funding was halted by the state legislature. But the pilot program in Missouri was kind of asking if you had any choice of birth control, what would people choose? But his first wife, Susan Buffett, had a family planning foundation that was that worked with companies like Allergan to make a low-cost IUD. I think it costs only $50. So yeah, so family planning is funded by surprising bedfellows.
Yeah, it's weird. It's a weird sort of discussion. And going back to that, I'm sorry, but going back to that question, what's helped with, I don't know, informed consent now is tribal sovereignty, because now with 638 hospitals, the clinics are now in our communities. So that's made, but that's, since 1990s at 638s have been going, and it's even larger now, is that the clinics are now in our own communities. Our own community people are working there. So that's changed a lot. That's made it's tribal sovereignty. That's what's made a difference. Sorry,
I realize what time it is, and lunch has arrived. If you guys could please join me in thanking our panelists and our speakers today for their time, for their advice, for their information, and for their scholarship. Thank you so very much.